As always, we're going to take a look at global energy commodities. Brent crude is up, but it's actually been down since its February and March highs. Despite Israel's counterstrike on Iran, prices have stayed still well below the $90 per barrel mark, although Brent did climb on Friday, closing the market up at 29 basis points. Of course, pretty much most of the market is reading Israel's limited strike as a sort of de-escalation of the conflict. But we'll see what happens in the next few weeks, whether there'll be a counter response from Iran, which would ultimately affect commodity markets. WTI also tracking the same. Natural gas down by 11 basis points. RBOB gasoline is up relatively flat by 2 basis points. Let's take a look at equities markets around the world, starting, of course, with the Nigeria Stock Exchange. The all-share index closed the week at 99,539.75 points, down 31 basis points. Of course, banking stocks and stocks of other industrials have been acting as a huge drag on the all-share index of the Nigeria Stock Exchange. So we're seeing a moderation in deal and volumes on the exchange, as well as values. Market cap still hovering below the 60 trillion naira mark. Let's take a look at what Africa is saying. The big stock exchanges around the continent. We'll take a look at Ghana. We'll look at Nairobi. We might even look at Morocco. Yes, there it is. South Africa is up by 13 basis points. Ghana relatively flat. Kenya is up, doing really well in the slew of all the economic reforms by William Ruto's government, up by 15.73%, the biggest move of any African stock exchange this past week. On the last day of trading, Morocco is down or relatively flattish by 2 basis points. What else is happening around global equities markets? Let's take a look at Europe. Yes, Europe, there we go. Now, Eurozone inflation figures for March came out at 2.4, down from the previous 2.6. And if you recall, the European Central Bank has an inflation target of 2%, so Europe obviously not doing too bad. London was up, but Eurostoxx index was still down by 8 basis points. Not a totally bad look, but if you look at Germany, Germany was down by 0.56%. Let's take a look at Wall Street. What is Wall Street saying to end the markets review this week? Well, it was probably a mixed picture on Wall Street. If I can get my Wall Street chat up now there, and if not, perhaps we'll move on to my top picks. So Wall Street, yes, there we go. Dow Jones was up by 22 basis points. S&P was down by 78 basis points. And the NASDAQ Composite Tech stocks down by 1.69%. Interestingly, it's earnings season again because Q1 results are going to come out. And I forgot to mention, actually, the London Stock Exchange is predicting a 12% downward trend in corporate earnings for Q1. So we'll see how that pans out. I'll talk about it on my show next weekend. Now, my top picks from around the world. The first story here is that Nigeria plans to trade oil and gas on the LagosCommodities and Futures Exchange. And that's according to the exchange CEO, who is working with the Securities and Exchange Commission to trade up to 50 million barrels of Nigeria crude oil on the LagosCommodities Exchange. Now, at today's prices, that's about a value of $4 billion a year in dollars. And this will be oil from oil producers, so mostly private companies, not NNPC, just to clarify. Of course, the Lagos Exchange is already trading precious metals like gold. And in fact, it started trading gold in 2022, but most of the other commodities being traded are soft commodities like paddy rice, cashews, sesame seeds, and the like. So that's a really interesting development here for producers, allowing them to access funding on capital markets, well, not capital markets this time, commodities markets for their operations. Elon Musk has said Tesla is trimming 10% of its global workforce. At the end of last year, Tesla had about 140,000 workers, but it's been facing stiff competition, particularly from Chinese EV makers. And in fact, China is now, many Chinese companies are very much now in the top 10 EV makers around the world. And last quarter, Tesla did announce for the first time since COVID, a downward decline in its sales tallies. Orders have gone down for Tesla vehicles as it faces a bit of a crunch in its sales trajectory. Archer Aviation a US Silicon Valley-based company, plans to launch an electric air taxi. Get this, electric air taxi in New Delhi in India. Reason being traffic on India's roads. Now, a journey that would have taken 60 to 9 minutes will take 7 minutes in this air taxi. If you're doing ride share such as Uber or one of those other things in India, you're paying between $12 and $18 for ride share. Now, with these new air taxis, you're paying about $36 to $48. So, about 3 to 4 times the cost of traveling by road, but it saves you quite a great deal of time. Archer Aviation is working with Stellantis and Boeing. It will need approval from the Federal Aviation Authority in the US to see this fully realized, but interesting development there for air taxis. Christine Lagarde is on a warpath with the US, and why do I say this? The US plans to use 260 billion euros in seized Russian assets to raise debt for Ukraine to finance Ukraine's war against Russia. So essentially, seized assets from the US, from Russia by the US and other G7 countries are about 260 billion euros worth. And that will serve, according to the US, as collateral to raise debt funding for Ukraine to fight its war with Russia. And Christine Lagarde is saying, this is illegal under international order. Well, the G7 countries haven't decided what they're going to do with all these assets. And in fact, some US stakeholders are saying you might as well just transfer the entirety of Russia's seized assets to Ukraine. So a bit of conflict there between these major world powers. Lagarde obviously has a very different view to the US. And finally, South African mining outlook is looking pretty good. 9.9% increase in mining output led by iron ore, gold, chrome ore. It's doing relatively well. The mining sector contributes about 10% to South Africa's GDP. So this is good news coming out of the February figures. And that's it for my top picks for the week.